As he crossed a freezing Chicago plaza lit by thousands of white Christmas bulbs racked around every tree, he felt something sharp grab his coat. Startled, he turned. She couldn't have been more than 6. A little girl, cheeks flushed red with cold, stood before him in a thin gray jacket and pink leggings, both too small for the weather. Her dark hair was tangled, her boots untied, and her eyes, large, wet, frantic, stared up at him like he was the last safe thing in a world gone sideways. She said nothing at first, just clutched a fistful of his coat with small trembling fingers, her chest rising and falling in sharp, panicked breaths. Dominic blinked, unsure if this was real. "Hey," he said, voice quieter than he expected. "Are you okay?" She opened her mouth, but no sound came, just tears. He knelt instinctively, suit forgotten, the snow soaking into his trousers. "Where's your mom or dad?" The little girl's lip trembled. "Please," she whispered hoarsely. "Please don't leave me." My mom disappeared. Her desperate plea collided violently with the lethal reality of his world. Instantly, a subtle shift occurred in the peripheral shadows of the brightly lit plaza. For men in heavy tailored overcoats, the ruthless security detail of the Chicago syndicate tightened their perimeter around the mafia boss and the weeping child. Marco, his lead enforcer, took half a step forward, his massive hand slipping silently beneath his lapel, but Dominic raised 2 fingers, freezing the guard in his tracks. Dominic looked back down at the little girl. She was shivering so violently that her teeth chattered, a rhythmic, agonizing sound that cut straight through the cheerful blare of a nearby brass quartet playing holiday carols. Dominic Vitiello, a man who had ruthlessly orchestrated the ruin of entire rival bloodlines without a second of hesitation, found himself completely paralyzed by the absolute vulnerability in her small face. His logical mind, the cold and calculating engine that ran the entire Chicago syndicate, told him to hand the weeping child to a uniform and walk away. He was a monster who lived in the dark, and this child belonged in the light. But the thick ice in his chest, frozen solid for over a decade, cracked just a fraction of an inch. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering gently over her small, trembling shoulder, when a sudden, jagged scream tore through the festive noise of the crowd. It was not a scream of holiday excitement, but a ragged, tearing sound of pure, unadulterated panic. Dominic stood smoothly in one fluid motion, stepping slightly in front of the child, his dark eyes tracking the source of the noise. A woman burst through a thick wall of laughing tourists, stumbling wildly onto the slick cobblestones. She was young, perhaps 26, but a profound exhaustion carved deep, shadowed lines into her pale face. Her gray coat was entirely too thin and torn at the hem, her hair a wild, chaotic tangle of dark waves whipped across her cheeks by the biting wind. She was not just running in a panic. She was actively, desperately fleeing. Her eyes, the exact same wide and frantic shape as the little girl's, scanned the crowded plaza with the manic, terrifying energy of a trapped animal about to be slaughtered. "Lily," she screamed, her voice breaking on the second syllable, a sound so full of agony it made the nearby shoppers freeze in their tracks. The little girl hiding behind Dominic gasped, a tiny, ragged intake of air, and threw herself around his solid leg. "Mommy," she sobbed openly. The woman's head snapped toward the small voice, her frantic gaze locking onto the child, and for a fraction of a second, a wave of profound, agonizing relief washed over her terrified features. She lunged forward, her worn boots slipping on the icy ground, and dropped to her bruised knees right beside Dominic, pulling the little girl into a fierce, bone-crushing embrace. The woman was shaking just as badly as the child, burying her tear-stained face in the girl's tangled dark hair, whispering a stream of frantic, breathless apologies into the freezing wind. Dominic took a slow step back, giving them space, fully intending to signal Marco and walk away into the snowy night. The immediate problem was solved. He had a vast criminal empire to run, illegal ledgers to balance, and men to bury before dawn. But as the exhausted mother looked up to thank the towering stranger in the bespoke suit, Dominic saw something deeply unsettling in her brown eyes. It was not just the residual fear of a mother losing her child. It was the active, suffocating, paralyzing dread of the hunted. He followed her terrified, darting gaze back through the dense holiday crowd. 30 yards away, pushing aggressively and violently through a cluster of laughing families, were 3 heavy-set men. They did not belong in this festive winter scene. They wore dark, cheap heavy coats, their postures rigid and aggressive, hands shoved deep into their pockets in a specific way that screamed of concealed weapons and bad intentions. They moved with the synchronized, predatory gait of street-level hitmen, their dead eyes scanning the faces of the terrified crowd with cold, methodical, ruthless intent. Dominic knew that exact walk. He had personally trained dozens of men to walk exactly like that before sending them out to collect blood debts. He looked back down at the mother, seeing the visceral way she instinctively curled her own fragile body over her daughter, desperately trying to make them both as small and invisible as possible. She knew exactly what those men were. She knew exactly what they would do to her. The 3 men suddenly stopped, their cruel eyes spotting her kneeling pitifully in the dirty snow. The lead thug, a massive brute with a severely scarred jaw, sneered openly and nudged his companion, pulling a heavy shape halfway out of his coat pocket. They began closing the distance fast, knocking a passing elderly couple aside without a single glance backward. Dominic felt a cold, familiar, murderous anger coil tightly in his gut. These were not his men. This plaza was his absolute territory, and some foolish rival had dared to unleash feral, rabid dogs in his front yard. The mother, realizing with absolute horror that she had been spotted, tried frantically to stand, trying to drag the weeping little girl up with her, but her legs gave out completely from sheer exhaustion and blind terror. She collapsed back into the slush. She looked up at Dominic, a complete stranger with cold eyes and an expensive coat, and did the only thing she had left to do in this world. She begged for her life. "Please," she choked out, hot tears mixing with the melting snow on her freezing face. "They are going to kill me. Please." It was the exact same desperate plea her tiny daughter had made just moments before. Dominic stared down at her, the heavy silence stretching between them, thick and suffocating despite the screaming wind. He was the undisputed head of the most ruthless and violent crime syndicate in the Midwest. He did not save helpless people. He broke them for profit. But looking at the fierce, hopeless, tragic protection in the mother's eyes, a ghost of a terrible memory surfaced, a phantom pain from a bloody night he had buried long ago alongside his own family. He looked up at the approaching thugs, now only 10 yards away, their greedy hands slipping fully out of their pockets to reveal the dull gleam of steel. Dominic did not hesitate for another second. He did not look back. He simply gave a sharp, imperceptible nod to Marco standing in the shadows. The transition from peace to extreme violence was instantaneous and absolute. Marco and 3 of Dominic's elite, heavily armed guards materialized from the holiday crowd like phantoms, moving with terrifying, practiced speed. They intercepted the 3 rival thugs with ruthless, bone-crushing precision, heavy bodies colliding with a sickening muffled thud, driving the enemy enforcers violently back into the dark shadows of a brick alleyway before the surrounding civilians even realized what was happening. The lethal threat was neutralized in absolute, terrifying silence. Dominic looked back down at the mother, whose pale mouth was parted in absolute shock at the sudden display of brutal power. He reached down without a word, grasping her upper arm with a leather-clad grip that was firm but not cruel, and hauled her effortlessly to her feet. "Walk," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that offered absolutely no room for debate or hesitation. He did not wait for her to agree or argue. He scooped the shivering little girl smoothly into his other arm, holding her securely against his broad chest, and turned his back on the alley, striding purposefully toward the street. The mother stumbled blindly after him, too terrified to resist, her wide eyes darting toward the dark alley where her pursuers had vanished without a trace. At the curb, a massive, armor-plated black SUV idled silently, thick exhaust pluming into the freezing night air. A driver in a shark suit stepped out immediately, pulling the heavy rear door open. Warm, conditioned air spilled out onto the snowy pavement, smelling faintly of rich leather and expensive cologne. Dominic practically shoved the stunned mother inside, climbing into the spacious cabin right behind her and setting the quiet child gently on the heated seat between them. The heavy, bulletproof door slammed shut, instantly and completely silencing the cheerful noise of the city, plunging the cabin into a thick, isolated, heavy quiet. Dominic stared blankly out the tinted window as the powerful vehicle smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving the snowy, chaotic plaza far behind. He could hear the mother's ragged, terrified breathing, could feel the little girl pressing her cold face against his side for warmth. He had just acted entirely on impulse, bringing a massive, unknown liability directly into his fortified world. He slowly closed his dark eyes, the tragic image of the mother's desperate, tear-stained face burning fiercely in his mind. He did not know who she was, who was hunting her, or what massive debt she carried on her frail shoulders, but as the SUV disappeared into the Chicago blizzard, he knew one thing with absolute, undeniable certainty. She belonged to him now. The armored SUV glided silently through the blinding whiteout of the Chicago blizzard, turning smoothly into the heavily fortified underground garage of a sleek glass and steel skyscraper. Dominic did not say a single word as the heavy iron gates slammed shut behind them, sealing up the howling wind and the desperate predators roaming the frozen streets. Clara sat completely rigid in the plush leather seat, her arms wrapped fiercely around her sleeping 6-year-old daughter. She was entirely numb, her wet clothes clinging to her trembling frame, her terrified eyes darting toward the silent, towering man sitting across from her in the dark cabin. When the powerful vehicle finally stopped, Marco opened the door, ushering them into a private, biometric elevator that shot upward in absolute, ear-popping silence. The metal doors parted smoothly to reveal a sprawling penthouse that felt less like a home and far more like a gilded fortress. Cold marble floors, sharp modern lines, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, godlike view of the snow-smothered city far below. An older woman named Teresa, her lined face a mask of practiced neutrality, appeared silently from a dark hallway. Dominic gave a short, commanding nod, and Teresa gently coaxed the exhausted, shivering little girl from Clara's tight grip, promising warm blankets and hot soup in the secure West Wing. Clara wanted to scream, wanted to snatch her daughter back and run blindly back into the storm, but her frozen legs simply refused to move. She was trapped in an opulent cage, entirely at the mercy of a towering stranger whose very presence commanded a suffocating, terrifying authority. Teresa led a practically catatonic Clara away to a massive guest suite, leaving Dominic standing completely alone in the silent, sprawling living room. He did not take off his heavy dark coat. He walked straight into his dimly lit study, the heavy oak doors sealing him inside his personal sanctuary of control. He poured a glass of expensive amber bourbon, but did not drink it, simply staring at the sharp reflection of the ice against the crystal glass. He pressed a silver button on his heavy mahogany desk. "Marco," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that filled the quiet room. "Find out exactly who she is. Find out exactly who those dogs in the plaza belong to. I want every single detail of her life on my desk in 10 minutes. The silence stretched tight as the storm raged violently against the reinforced glass. Dominic stared down at the blinking lights of the massive city he ruthlessly controlled. He had built an empire of blood and fear, a massive criminal syndicate that operated with flawless, mechanical precision, crushing anything that dared to stand in its path. Yet tonight, he had inexplicably broken his own ironclad roles to pull a drowning mother and child from the freezing depths. 20 minutes later, the heavy oak doors opened. Marco stepped inside, his usually stoic, scarred face tight with a strange, unspoken tension. He placed a thick, leather-bound file directly in the center of the polished desk. "Her name is Clara Hayes," Marco said quietly, maintaining a respectful distance. "The men hunting her belong to the Russian outfit operating on the south side. Her father died 6 months ago, leaving her drowning in a massive, high-interest street debt for $150,000. She missed her final payment this week. They were coming to collect it in blood." Dominic stared at the closed file, his square jaw clenching tight. A debt of $450,000 was an absolute death sentence for a single mother. But Marco did not step back into the shadows. The hulking enforcer hesitated, a very rare occurrence that made the air in the room turn instantly colder. "There is more, boss," Marco continued, his rough voice dropping an octave lower. "She is not a stranger to our organization." Dominic looked up sharply, his dark eyes narrowing into lethal, calculating slits. He reached out and opened the file, his gaze scanning the crisp, printed pages of her background and employment history. His breath caught sharply in his chest. Clara Hayes was an active employee of the Vanguard Casino, his most lucrative, legitimate front in the entire city. She was a night shift cleaner, spending her nights scrubbing the marble floors of his empire for a miserable minimum wage. Dominic read the final, damning line on the page, his knuckles turning pure white as his grip on the heavy paper tightened dangerously. "Terminated. Effective this morning." The authorization signature belonged to Silas, his ambitious, cruel, and highly profitable underboss. The manager's typed note beside the official termination was brief and entirely devoid of all human empathy. "Repeated tardiness, frequent failure to meet early shift requirements, prioritizes personal family matters over productivity, uncooperative attitude." Dominic stared at the cruel words, the harsh reality hitting him like a heavy physical blow. She had been mercilessly fired today. She had been thrown directly into the freezing streets, stripped of her only meager income, and actively hunted by violent loan sharks, all because she had likely struggled to find someone to watch her little girl in the morning. He had spent his life building an untouchable empire, a massive machine specifically designed to generate vast wealth and absolute power. But he had created a system so incredibly cold and unforgiving that it had brutally punished a desperate mother for simply trying to survive. His own ruthless machine had pushed her directly into the crosshairs of a loaded Russian gun. The bitter, awful irony twisted painfully in his deep chest. Before Dominic could speak a single word, a sudden, sharp gasp echoed from the open doorway of the study. He looked up instantly, his hand dropping away from the damning file. Clara stood completely frozen in the threshold, wearing a borrowed white terry cloth robe that practically swallowed her fragile, shivering frame. Her damp, dark hair hung wildly around her pale shoulders. She had woken up, panicked in the unfamiliar, opulent surroundings, and wandered out desperately searching for the man who had taken them from the snow. But her wide, terrified brown eyes were not fixed on Dominic's face. They were locked in pure, unadulterated horror on the massive, ornate crest carved deeply into the solid mahogany wall directly behind his desk. It was the cross swords and wolf emblem of the Chicago Syndicate, the exact same terrifying crest that was printed on every single security badge at the Vanguard Casino. Her trembling gaze slowly dropped from the terrifying emblem down to Dominic's stoic face, the fragmented pieces of her living nightmare clicking together with the sickening, paralyzing clarity. The immaculate, expensive suit, the heavily armed guards waiting in the plaza, the absolute, unquestioned power radiating from him. She knew exactly who he was. He was not a kind savior. He was Dominic Vitiello, the ruthless, blood-soaked boss of the very mafia that owned the entire city, the exact same dangerous man whose cruel underboss had gleefully destroyed her fragile life only hours ago. Clara backed away slowly, her bare feet retreating against the plush carpet, her chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths that sounded incredibly loud in the silent room. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking so violently it barely registered over the howling wind outside the window. "No, please. You're him. You're the head of the syndicate." Dominic stood up very slowly from his leather chair, keeping his large hands perfectly visible, his harsh expression carefully blank to mask the sudden, sharp regret actively tearing at his insides. "Clara," he said, his voice low and incredibly steady, desperately attempting to bridge the massive, terrifying gap between them. "Listen to me." But Clara shook her head wildly, her eyes wide with the absolute, agonizing certainty of a trapped prey staring directly into the jaws of an apex predator. She knew the syndicate's reputation for extreme, unforgiving brutality, knew that a massive money debt to the rival Russians was nothing compared to being locked inside the high-security penthouse of the most dangerous man in Chicago. She turned abruptly and ran blindly toward the long hallway, her bare feet slapping loudly against the freezing marble floors, absolutely desperate to find her sleeping daughter and escape into the deadly blizzard, actively choosing the freezing, violent streets over the terrifying mercy of a mafia king. The pale gray light of a brutal Chicago dawn bled through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the silent rooms. Clara had not slept a single second. She had spent the entire night sitting rigidly on the edge of the velvet guest bed, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of 6-year-old Lily's chest. The crushing realization of exactly whose fortress they were sleeping inside had paralyzed her for hours, but as the storm outside finally began to quiet into a heavy, suffocating snowfall, her maternal survival instinct flared into absolute panic. Dominic Vitiello was not a savior. He was the apex predator of the city, a man whose name was only ever whispered in terrified breaths in the dark alleys and back rooms where she scrubbed floors. She knew with visceral certainty that owing her life to the Chicago syndicate was a fate infinitely worse than facing the brutal street thugs who held her father's massive debt. Moving with absolute, desperate silence, she bundled a groggy, confused Lily back into her damp coat and oversized boots. She did not dare take anything from the opulent room, terrified of leaving any trace. She tiptoed down the sprawling, dimly lit hallway, her heart hammering violently against her ribs like a trapped bird. The penthouse felt unnervingly empty, the heavy silence ringing in her ears as she reached the sleek biometric elevator. By some absolute miracle, the doors slid open at her touch, the system perhaps not fully locked down for the morning. She pulled Lily inside, pressing the lobby button with a trembling finger, holding her breath as the luxurious metal box began its silent, rapid descent. She mentally calculated her desperate path. She would run straight to the bus station, use the few crumpled dollars in her pocket, and vanish into the frozen sprawl of the city before the mafia boss even realized she was gone. The elevator slowed, the digital display flashing the final floor, and the silver doors parted with a soft, melodic chime. Clara stepped forward, pulling Lily tightly against her side, but her frantic momentum died in a single, horrifying second. The sprawling, immaculate marble lobby was not empty. The pale morning light pouring through the glass walls illuminated 8 massive, hardened men blocking the main exit. They wore thick, snow-dusted coats and dark leather gloves, their postures screaming of casual, practiced violence. In the center of the pack stood the hulking, scarred brute from the plaza the night before. His cruel, dead eyes locked onto Clara instantly, a slow, predatory smile twisting his ruined jaw. They had found her. They had tracked her through the blizzard, waiting out the storm like rabid dogs at the gates of a fortress. Clara froze entirely, all the blood draining from her face, her terrified mind completely short-circuiting. She tried to step backward into the elevator, to frantically smash the buttons and retreat, but a massive hand suddenly slammed against the closing metal door, forcing it violently back open. The scarred Russian stepped into her personal space, the harsh smell of stale tobacco and cold sweat suffocating her. "You're very hard to find, little mouse," he rasped, his thick accent dripping with malicious intent. "Your father left a very messy ledger. $450,000 does not just disappear into the snow." Clara pushed Lily behind her legs, her entire body shaking uncontrollably, tears of pure, absolute helplessness spilling over her pale cheeks. She opened her mouth to beg, to plead for just a few more days, but a sound suddenly echoed through the cavernous lobby that made the Russian enforcer stiffen and slowly turn his massive head. It was the slow, rhythmic, completely unhurried sound of expensive leather shoes walking across the polished marble floor. Dominic Vitiello descended the sweeping grand staircase from the mezzanine level, his tailored dark suit immaculate, his expression a terrifying, blank mask of absolute authority. He was not alone. From every single, shadowed corner of the massive lobby, the syndicate materialized. 12 heavily armed, elite guards stepped silently into the pale morning light, raising suppressed automatic weapons with lethal, synchronized precision. The red dots of laser sights danced across the chests and foreheads of the Russian thugs, turning the hunters instantly into terrified prey. Dominic stopped 10 feet away from the scarred Russian, his dark eyes radiating a cold, murderous intent that dropped the temperature of the room by 10 degrees. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once. Marco, stepping out from behind a marble pillar, swung the heavy, solid steel stock of his rifle directly into the side of the scarred Russian's knee. The sickening crack of bone echoed loudly, and the massive thug collapsed to the floor with a ragged, agonized scream, clutching his shattered leg. The other 7 Russians flinched, their hands twitching toward their hidden weapons, but the distinctive, metallic clattering of a dozen safety levers clicking off froze them completely in their tracks. "You are standing inside my home," Dominic stated quietly, his voice carrying the terrifying weight of absolute power. "You are breathing my air. You are threatening a woman standing on my marble." The bleeding Russian on the floor groaned, his face pale with shock, desperately holding up a shaking, gloved hand. "She owes us," the thug gasped out, spitting blood onto the pristine floor. "450,000. It is a sanctioned street debt. We have the right to collect." Dominic stared down at the broken man for a long, heavy moment, the absolute silence of the room punctuated only by Lily's muffled, terrified whimpers. He reached slowly into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, producing a sleek, black cellular phone. He dialed a single number, his cold eyes never leaving the bleeding Russian. "Transfer $450,000 to the Volkov account," Dominic ordered quietly into the phone. "The debt is cleared." He ended the call, slipping the phone back into his coat with agonizing slowness. "The ledger is balanced," Dominic said softly, looking at the terrified rival crew. "If I ever see a single one of your faces within 10 miles of this building again, I will personally burn your entire South Side operation to the ground with you trapped inside it. Drag this trash out of my sight." The remaining Russians scrambled frantically, hauling their crippled leader up by his armpits and practically dragging him out through the revolving glass doors, disappearing into the blinding white snow. The heavy silence rushed back into the lobby, suffocating and thick. Clara stood completely paralyzed, her chest heaving, her knuckles white where she gripped Lily's small shoulders. She had just watched a man casually dismiss an army and a race of fortune with a single, quiet phone call. Dominic slowly turned his terrifying, dark gaze upon her. The absolute coldness in his eyes made her want to weep. He closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, stopping just inches away from her trembling frame. You do not owe the Russians anymore, Clara, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur that vibrated with dangerous, possessive authority. You owe the Chicago Syndicate. You owe me for $150,000. And until every single penny of that debt is paid in full, you belong entirely to me. You will not leave this building. You will not leave my sight. If you ever attempt to run from me again, there is not a single dark corner on this earth where I will not find you. The sheer gravity of his words crashed over her like a freezing ocean wave, drowning her completely. She had tried to escape the wolves, only to find herself permanently locked inside the cage of the devil himself. The journey away from the city was a blur of blinding white snow and oppressive silence inside the armored convoy. Clara sat rigidly in the back of the massive vehicle, clutching a quiet lily as the towering steel skyscrapers of Chicago gave way to the desolate, frozen woods of the deep suburbs. They passed through 2 heavily armed checkpoints before massive wrought iron gates groaned open, revealing Dominic Vitiello's private compound. It was a sprawling stone fortress isolated from the entire world, surrounded by high walls topped with security cameras and roaming guards. When they were escorted inside the cavernous, echoing manor, the sheer scale of the wealth and isolation threatened to crush Clara completely. She was shown to a suite of rooms larger than any apartment she had ever lived in, filled with warm fires and soft beds, but the luxurious surroundings only made the invisible bars of her cage feel infinitely heavier. She was a captive holding a massive debt of $450,000, completely at the mercy of a ruthless mafia boss who could make her disappear with a single whisper. The sheer terror of her situation paralyzed her for hours, but as she watched Lily tentatively explore the warm, plush rugs, a fierce, desperate surge of maternal defiance clawed its way up her throat. She would not be a helpless victim waiting for the predator to decide her fate. Leaving Lily happily eating a bowl of hot soup under the watchful eye of the silent housekeeper, Teresa, Clara marched directly down the sprawling marble hallway toward the heavy oak doors of Dominic's private study. She did not knock. She pushed the heavy doors open, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Dominic sat behind a massive mahogany desk, the dark room lit only by the flickering fire and the glow of a computer monitor. 2 hulking guards instantly stepped out from the shadows, their hands dropping to their holstered weapons, but Dominic raised a single hand, freezing them in place. He looked at Clara, his dark eyes completely unreadable, waiting in heavy silence. "I am not a charity case," Clara stated, her voice trembling slightly, but laced with an absolute, desperate resolve. "And I am not a prisoner waiting to be sold. I owe you $450,000, and I will work for every single penny of it." Dominic leaned back slowly in his leather chair, the heavy material creaking loudly in the quiet room. He studied her pale, determined face, a flicker of genuine surprise briefly crossing his stoic features. Most grown men would have begged or wept on their knees, but this fragile, exhausted mother was standing in the absolute center of his power and demanding employment. "You clean casino floors," he said quietly, his gravelly voice carrying a dangerous, cutting edge. "It would take you 4 lifetimes to scrub away a street debt of that enormous size." Clara stepped closer, refusing to look away from his piercing gaze, fighting the visceral instinct to cower. "I am smart," she countered desperately, her nails digging painfully into her own palms until they nearly bled. "I kept the books for my father before he fell apart and borrowed from the worst people in the city. I can organize. I can audit. Put me to work in your businesses. The legal ones. I will not be a captive in a guest room." The heavy silence stretched between them, thick with a volatile mix of mutual distrust and unexpected respect. Dominic stared at her, seeing the fierce, unbreakable steel hidden beneath her fragile exterior. He gave a short, commanding nod. He dismissed the guards with a flick of his wrist and pointed to a small, heavy wooden desk situated in the far corner of his vast study. "The Vanguard Casino is only a tiny fraction of my legitimate portfolio," he stated, his voice devoid of all warmth. "I run massive global logistics fronts. Shipping, freight, international supply chains. The ledgers are incredibly complex and currently disorganized. You will sit at that desk. You will audit the logistics files. You will find the financial inefficiencies. And you will absolutely not ask questions about anything else you see or hear in this room." Clara nodded once, a sharp wave of relief washing over her terrified mind. It was a gilded cage, but she had secured a purpose, a tiny fraction of control over her terrifying new reality. For the next 3 days, the massive study became a tense, suffocating battleground of silent proximity. Clara sat at her small desk, surrounded by towering stacks of complex financial ledgers and shipping manifests, her sharp mind quickly unraveling the intricate web of numbers and international shipping routes. Dominic worked at his massive desk only 20 feet away, conducting quiet, terrifying meetings with hardened men who smelled of cold wind and violence, men who spoke in hushed tones about shipments, territories, and blood. Clara kept her head rigidly down, her pencil moving frantically, desperately trying to tune out the dark reality of the criminal empire breathing directly down her neck. She remained hyper-vigilant, every single muscle in her body wound tight, perpetually waiting for the inevitable moment when the monster would turn his cruel attention toward her. But the monster never did. Instead, Clara began to witness something incredibly strange and deeply unsettling. It happened late on the third afternoon, while the snow continued to fall heavily outside the massive windows, burying the compound in a suffocating white blanket. Lily, bored of the safe confines of the guest wing, had wandered silently into the heavy study, clutching a worn coloring book and a fistful of crayons. Clara froze in absolute terror, her breath catching painfully in her throat, fully expecting Dominic to erupt in furious anger at the sudden intrusion into his private sanctuary. Dominic stopped speaking mid-sentence, dismissing a terrified lieutenant with a sharp, impatient wave of his hand. The hardened criminal practically sprinted from the room, leaving the mafia boss completely alone with the cautious little girl and her terrified mother. Clara watched, completely paralyzed, as Lily walked right up to the massive mahogany desk, her small head barely reaching the polished wood. "My red crayon broke," Lily announced quietly, holding up the snapped piece of wax toward the most dangerous man in Chicago. Dominic stared down at the small child, his broad, dangerous shoulders completely rigid under his expensive suit. The suffocating silence stretched into what felt like an eternity, but then, slowly, the terrifying head of the syndicate did something entirely unexpected. He reached into the top drawer of his desk, pushing aside a loaded, heavy black pistol, and pulled out a silver roll of expensive clear tape. He leaned forward, his massive, scarred hands moving with an incredibly gentle, practiced precision, and carefully taped the tiny red crayon back together. He handed it back to Lily without a single word. Lily beamed, a bright, innocent smile that completely transformed the dark, oppressive room. "Thank you, mister," she chirped, before dropping completely unbothered onto the expensive Persian rug to color. Clara stared at Dominic, her heart aching with a sudden, confusing intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. The absolute coldness in his dark eyes had momentarily vanished, replaced by a deep, hollow, agonizing grief that she recognized instantly. It was the haunted, empty look of a man who had lost something incredibly precious, a man who knew exactly how to fix a broken child's toy because he had once done it 1,000 times before in a past life. Dominic looked up and caught Clara staring at him from across the silent room. The heavy, sorrowful vulnerability vanished from his eyes in a fraction of a second, immediately replaced by the cold, ruthless armor of a mafia king. He turned his attention forcefully back to his glowing computer screens, his jaw clenched impossibly tight, completely refusing to acknowledge the profound, tragic humanity he had just accidentally revealed. Clara slowly turned back to her. massive stacks of ledgers, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped her pencil. She had been absolutely certain that Dominic Vitiello was nothing but a cold-blooded, soulless monster, but as she listened to the soft, rhythmic scratching of Lily's red crayon against the paper, she realized with terrifying clarity that the ruthless man who held her entire life in his hands was bleeding from an invisible, tragic wound that was just as deep and agonizing as her own. The heavy snowfall continued to bury the compound in absolute white isolation as a full week dragged past inside the suffocating walls of the private study. Clara sat rigidly at her small wooden desk in the far corner, the dim amber light of a brass reading lamp illuminating the massive, teetering stacks of international logistics ledgers and casino financial records. She had barely slept in over 90 hours, her exhausted eyes burning fiercely as she traced endless, dizzying columns of printed numbers with the very tip of her dull pencil. Across the cavernous room, Dominic Vitiello sat behind his sprawling mahogany desk like a dark, immovable statue, conducting his ruthless empire in low, dangerous murmurs over encrypted phone lines. The suffocating proximity between them was a constant, physical weight, but Clara had discovered a strange, terrifying refuge in the chaotic mathematics of his legitimate businesses. She possessed a brilliant, analytical mind forged by years of desperate survival, and as she dug deeper into the intricate shipping manifests of the Vanguard Casino's supply chain, an incredibly disturbing pattern began to slowly materialize from the dense black ink. It started as a tiny, almost invisible discrepancy, a missing sum of $10,000 mislabeled as a routine freight maintenance fee. But as Clara carefully cross-referenced the specific dates with the international routing numbers, the tiny crack fractured into a massive, gaping canyon of calculated theft. Someone within the highest echelon of the Chicago syndicate was actively bleeding the boss dry. Clara's heart began to hammer a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs as her pencil frantically connected the hidden ghost accounts. $200,000 vanished in February. $500,000 disappeared in April. By the time her trembling finger reached the end of the fiscal year, the total amount of stolen money exceeded $4 million. She traced the fraudulent authorization signatures through a complex maze of offshore shell corporations, but the digital ink always flowed back to one single, undeniable source. It was Silas, the cruel, ambitious underboss who had mercilessly fired her from her cleaning job just days ago. Clara stopped breathing entirely, the air in her lungs turning into solid ice. She stared at the damning ledger, a sudden, horrifying realization washing over her terrified mind. Silas was not just stealing money. He was actively destabilizing Dominic's entire financial foundation. If Silas possessed the sheer arrogance to steal $4 million from the most dangerous mafia boss in the Midwest, he was undoubtedly preparing to stage a violent, bloody coup. The terrifying thought instantly connected to the brutal Russian loan sharks in the snowy plaza. Silas had fired her, stripped away her meager protection, and left her for the Russians to slaughter, and now those very same Russian accounts were receiving regular, massive cash deposits from Silas's ghost companies. It was a massive, carefully orchestrated betrayal happening directly under Dominic's roof. Clara looked up slowly from the small wooden desk, her wide, terrified brown eyes fixing on the imposing silhouette of the mafia king across the quiet room. She was just a captive, an indebted cleaner holding a massive debt of $450,000. If she spoke up, she was directly accusing the second most powerful man in the criminal underworld of treason. Silas would absolutely butcher her and Lily without a single hesitation. Her raw, primal survival instinct screamed at her to shut the leather ledger, lower her head, and remain completely invisible. But as she watched Dominic rub his temple with a weary, exhausted hand, the heavy burden of his bloody crown visibly weighing down his broad shoulders, a fierce, unexpected wave of absolute loyalty flared hot in her chest. He had shielded her fragile daughter in the freezing snow. He had stood bravely between her and the Russian guns. He had given her a safe, warm room. When the entire world had left her to freeze in the gutter, Clara closed the thick leather-bound ledger with a soft, definitive thud that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet study. Dominic stopped writing immediately, his dark, dangerous eyes flicking upward to lock onto her pale face. The silence in the room became instantly sharp and lethal. Clara stood up, her legs trembling violently, and picked up the heavy book. She did not hesitate. She walked directly across the massive Persian rug, each step feeling like a long, terrifying march toward her own execution, until she stopped right in front of his polished mahogany desk. Dominic stared up at her, his expression a terrifying, blank mask of absolute authority, waiting patiently for her to speak. "You told me to audit the logistics files," Clara whispered, her voice shaking but completely refusing to break. "You told me to find the financial inefficiencies." She placed the heavy ledger directly onto the center of his immaculate desk, flipping it open to the heavily annotated final page. Her pencil markings covered the pristine margins in a chaotic, desperate web of red ink. Dominic did not say a single word. He leaned forward slowly, the leather of his expensive chair creaking loudly, and looked down at the numbers. Clara watched his dark eyes scan the complex web of shell corporations and missing funds, her own heart practically beating out of her chest. For 3 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the entire room was the soft crackling of the fireplace and the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the long hallway. When Dominic finally reached the bottom of the page, tracing the final stolen $4 million directly to Silas's authorization signature, the temperature in the study plummeted to absolute zero. He did not yell. He did not flip the heavy desk or draw the loaded weapon resting in his top drawer. His terrifying reaction was incredibly, unnervingly still. He looked up at Clara, and the absolute, murderous darkness in his eyes made her instinctively take a frightened step backward. "How long did it take you to unravel the structure?" Dominic asked quietly, his low, gravelly voice entirely devoid of all human emotion. Clara swallowed hard, forcing her trembling hands to remain strictly at her sides. 3 days, she answered breathlessly. The routing numbers were deliberately buried under legitimate casino supply purchases, but the offshore destinations matched the exact accounts utilized by the Russian crew that hunted me in the plaza. Silas is not just stealing from you. He is funding your enemies. He is buying their muscle to move against you. Dominic stared at her, the heavy, suffocating silence stretching between them once again. He was a man surrounded entirely by hardened killers, brutal enforcers, and greedy lieutenants, yet none of his highly paid men had noticed a massive, multi-million-dollar hemorrhage right beneath their very noses. It took a desperate, terrified single mother with a sharp mind and a dull pencil to uncover the greatest betrayal of his entire violent life. The heavy, oppressive dynamic between them shifted completely in that exact, crystal-clear moment. The invisible, suffocating chains of her massive street debt seemed to dissolve instantly into the quiet air. Dominic slowly closed the ledger, his large, scarred hand resting flat against the dark leather cover. The murderous fury in his eyes receded just a fraction, replaced by a deep, profound respect that he had not felt for another living soul in over a decade. He was no longer looking at a helpless victim or a desperate captive. He was looking at an incredibly brave, fiercely intelligent woman who had just willingly risked her own life to protect his empire. "Silas made a very fatal miscalculation when he fired you," Dominic stated softly, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, absolute certainty. "He threw away the smartest person in my entire organization." He stood up slowly from his chair, towering over her fragile frame, but for the very first time since the blizzard, Clara did not feel the visceral urge to run away. He reached across the massive desk and picked up a heavy crystal glass, pouring a small measure of expensive amber bourbon, and held it out toward her. It was not a gesture of charity or intimidation. It was a formal offering of a strategic, highly dangerous partnership. Clara looked at the expensive glass, her trembling fingers slowly reaching out to accept it. Their bare skin brushed for a brief, electric second, a sudden spark of unexpected warmth cutting straight through the freezing tension of the room. "We are going to burn Silas to the ground," Dominic whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intense, blazing heat. "And you're going to help me light the match." The tension inside the fortified compound thickened into a suffocating, physical weight over the next 48 hours as the heavy winter snow continued to bury the isolated estate beneath a blinding white blanket. Dominic had not yet moved openly against Silas, choosing instead to quietly reposition his most loyal enforcers and gather absolute, undeniable proof of the impending coup, turning the sprawling stone mansion into a paranoid, heavily armed powder keg. Dozens of grim men in dark suits patrolled the perimeter with suppressed rifles, their hushed, tense whispers echoing down the long marble corridors while the storm raged violently against the reinforced glass windows. Clara felt the dangerous, electric current of impending violence thrumming steadily through the thick walls, her nerves frayed to an absolute breaking point as she continued to quietly audit the compromised ledgers in the corner of the study. She knew she was sitting on a massive, deadly secret, a multi-million-dollar betrayal that would inevitably drown the entire Chicago syndicate in a river of blood. Late on a freezing Tuesday evening, long after the towering grandfather clock in the central hallway had softly chimed midnight, Clara found herself entirely alone in the massive, dimly lit library. Lily was finally asleep in the secure guest wing, completely oblivious to the bloody mafia war brewing silently around them, guarded by Teresa and two massive sentries. Clara stood shivering slightly near the towering stone fireplace, her thin arms wrapped tightly around her own fragile waist, watching the hypnotic, dancing orange flames desperately trying to chase the deep chill from her exhausted bones. She did not hear the heavy oak doors open, but she felt the sudden, distinct shift in the ambient air, a heavy, commanding presence that made the tiny hairs on the back of her neck stand straight up. Dominic walked slowly into the warm circle of firelight, his usually impeccable suit jacket discarded somewhere in the dark, the sleeves of his dark dress shirt rolled up past his elbows to reveal thick, corded forearms covered in a chaotic map of faded, violent scars. He looked incredibly, profoundly exhausted, the ruthless, terrifying armor of the feared mafia king momentarily stripped away to reveal the deeply wounded, incredibly tired man breathing heavily underneath. He stopped just a few feet away from her, staring silently into the crackling fire, a half-empty crystal glass of expensive amber bourbon gripped so tightly in his large hand that his knuckles were pure white. For a very long time, neither of them spoke a single word, allowing the soft, rhythmic popping of the burning wood and the distant howling of the blizzard to fill the heavy, charged silence between them. "They came for me on a night exactly like this one," Dominic whispered suddenly, his gravelly voice so incredibly low and broken that Clara had to strain to hear it over the crackling flames. Clara froze completely, her wide brown eyes slowly turning to look up at his harsh, shadowed profile illuminated by the fire. He took a slow, deep breath, his broad chest rising and falling heavily as he stared into the fire like it was a clear window to a terrible, bloody past he could never escape. 10 years ago, he continued, his voice entirely devoid of all normal human emotion, but carrying a devastating, agonizing weight that crushed the air from the room. "I was young, highly ambitious, and incredibly arrogant. I thought I had built a completely impenetrable fortress around my life. I thought I could keep the brutal, unforgiving violence of the syndicate entirely separate from my front door." He closed his dark eyes for a fraction of a second, his square jaw clenching so tightly that Clara could see the muscles jumping furiously under his skin. "My wife was named Elena. My daughter was 3 years old. Her name was Mia." The beautiful, tragic names hit the quiet air like heavy, sinking stones, plunging the grand library into a suffocating, sorrowful stillness. Clara felt a sudden, sharp ache bloom painfully in her own chest, her fierce maternal instinct immediately grasping the sheer, unimaginable horror of his halting words. "A rival family bribed a captain in my inner circle," Dominic stated softly, taking a slow, heavy swallow of the dark bourbon. "They bypassed the perimeter security. They waited quietly in the dark of my own living room. I was delayed at a territory meeting across the city, negotiating shipping routes while my world ended. By the time I finally reached my own front door, the snow on the porch was completely red. They did not just kill them quickly. They made absolutely sure I understood the terrible, permanent cost of wearing this bloody crown." Dominic opened his eyes, turning his terrifying, haunted gaze directly upon Clara, stripping away the final, protective layers of his cold, impenetrable ice. "I buried my entire heart in the frozen ground 10 years ago. I became a ruthless, untouchable monster because monsters do not feel pain. Monsters do not bleed." But then a terrified 6-year-old girl grabbed my coat in a snowy plaza, and a desperate mother stared up at me with the exact same frantic, hopeless terror that Elena must have felt in her final, agonizing moments. Clara stared up at him, hot, silent tears tracking slowly down her pale cheeks, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The absolute, agonizing tragedy of his sudden confession completely shattered the heavy, invisible walls of fear and debt standing between them. He was not just a cold-blooded captor holding her massive street debt over her head. He was a deeply broken survivor, a tragically scarred man who had built an entire global empire of fear simply to ensure he would never have to feel that level of helpless, suffocating agony ever again. Clara took a slow, trembling step closer to him, completely forgetting the massive, dangerous gap in their stations, completely forgetting the ruthless men guarding the halls outside. "I spent my entire life being terrified," Clara whispered back, her voice shaking with raw, unprotected honesty as she looked up into his shadowed face. "My father slowly gambled away our rent, our food, our absolute safety. I scrubbed blood and vomit off casino floors for pennies while looking over my shoulder every single second, terrified that the loan sharks would finally come to take Lily away from me to settle his ledgers. I thought the absolute worst thing that could ever happen to me was being dragged into the dark, violent world of the Chicago syndicate." She looked up deeply into his dark, grieving eyes, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs with a sudden, overwhelming emotion that she could no longer suppress or hide. "But you are the only person in my entire miserable life who has ever stood between me and the wolves." Dominic stared down at her fragile, tear-stained face, the heavy, crystal glass slipping slowly from his loosened grip to shatter harmlessly into a dozen pieces against the thick stone hearth. He reached out with both of his large, scarred hands, gently framing her pale, delicate face, his callous thumbs slowly wiping away the hot tears falling continuously across her cheeks. His touch was incredibly, shockingly tender, a stark, profound contrast to the extreme, brutal violence he commanded on a daily basis. Clara did not flinch away from his dangerous hands. She leaned into his warm, solid palms, a soft, breathless gasp escaping her slightly parted lips as she closed her eyes. The crushing, suffocating tension that had defined their relationship for the past terrible week instantly ignited into a fierce, blinding, undeniable heat. Dominic leaned down, his face hovering just a fraction of an inch above hers, his warm breath ghosting across her trembling mouth, smelling faintly of expensive bourbon and deep sorrow. "You do not owe me anything, Clara," he murmured fiercely against her lips, his voice thick with a raw, desperate need that had been buried for a decade. "You never did." He kissed her. It was not a gentle, composed, or polite kiss. It was heavy, desperate, and completely consuming, a sudden physical collision of two deeply scarred survivors desperately clinging to each other in the terrifying dark. Clara melted entirely against his broad, solid chest, her hands tangling wildly in his dark hair, kissing him back with an equal, starving intensity that demanded all the remaining air in her lungs. The deep, heavy kiss tasted of amber bourbon, salty tears, and the fierce, undeniable promise of absolute protection. For the very first time in 10 long, agonizing years, the Ruthless MAFIA king felt the thick, suffocating ice in his chest completely melt away, replaced by a burning, protective fire that would absolutely consume anyone who ever dared to threaten his new, fiercely chosen family. The fragile peace established in the quiet library was shattered mere hours before dawn. Dominic did not return to sleep after that profound, desperate kiss. He knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that the agonizing vulnerability they had just shared was a massive liability in a world ruled by blood. If Silas had already successfully moved $4 million, the traitorous underboss possessed the necessary capital to buy a small, heavily armed private army. The sprawling stone compound was no longer a fortress. It was a brightly lit target. Dominic moved with ruthless, cold efficiency, pulling Clara from the warm guest bed and ordering her to pack nothing but the absolute essentials. Lily was roused from her deep sleep, confused and shivering as Clara bundled her into a heavy winter coat. Within 20 minutes, the heavy iron gates of the estate groaned open. 3 massive, heavily armored black vehicles slipped silently out into the freezing, pitch-black morning. Dominic rode in the center SUV, sitting rigidly beside Clara and Lily in the spacious back seat. He wore a dark, tactical overcoat, his large hands resting calmly on the grips of a suppressed automatic rifle resting across his knees. Marco drove the vehicle in absolute, heavy silence, his scarred eyes constantly scanning the desolate, snow-covered roads. Clara held Lily tightly against her chest, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. The romantic, heavy warmth of the library felt like a distant, impossible dream as the harsh, terrifying reality of the Chicago syndicate closed back in around them. They drove for 45 minutes through the dark, winding suburban roads, heading toward a highly classified, off-book safe house completely isolated in the deep northern woods. The dense, skeletal trees pressed closely against the sides of the narrow 2-lane highway, creating a suffocating, claustrophobic tunnel of black ice and swirling snow. Dominic stared out the reinforced, tinted window, his jaw clenched impossibly tight. Something in the dead, quiet air felt profoundly wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood straight up, a primal, violent instinct forged by decades of surviving brutal street wars. He leaned forward to give Marco an immediate order to turn the heavy vehicle around. He never got the chance to speak the words. A blinding, massive flash of orange heat erupted from the dark tree line directly ahead of them. The concussive, deafening roar of a heavy explosive device completely shattered the quiet winter morning. The lead armored vehicle was thrown violently into the air like a discarded toy, landing on its crushed roof in a horrific tangle of screaming metal and shattered glass. Marco slammed on the heavy brakes, throwing the massive SUV into a violent, sideways skid across the black ice. Clara screamed, instinctively throwing her entire body over Lily as the vehicle violently jerked and slammed against the frozen guardrail. Before the deafening echo of the massive explosion could even fade into the freezing woods, the dark tree line completely erupted in blinding muzzle flashes. Over 24 heavily armed men stepped out from the dense, snowy shadows, their faces hidden behind dark tactical masks. They were a lethal, terrifying combination of Silas's highly trained, traitorous syndicate enforcers and the brutal, scarred Russian loan sharks seeking absolute, bloody revenge. It was a perfectly executed, incredibly massive ambush. Heavy, relentless automatic gunfire rained down on the trapped convoy like a devastating iron hail storm. The deafening, rhythmic hammering of high-caliber bullets slamming into the armor-plated doors and reinforced glass was absolutely terrifying. The tail vehicle immediately erupted in a shower of sparks and hissing steam as the engine block was shredded by a concentrated volley of armor-piercing rounds. Dominic did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He threw his massive, heavy body completely over Clara and Lily, pressing them flat against the floorboards of the chaotic cabin. "Stay exactly down," he roared, his voice completely drowning out the deafening gunfire. Marco kicked his door open, rolling violently out into the freezing snow with his weapon raised, returning a precise, lethal burst of fire that dropped two of the advancing, masked men instantly. Dominic's remaining elite personal guards poured out of the crippled tail vehicle, taking up defensive positions behind the smoking metal, but they were vastly, overwhelmingly outnumbered. The brutal, relentless crossfire pinned the loyal men down completely. Bullets continuously ripped through the freezing air, shattering the frozen trees and chewing massive, jagged holes into the asphalt. Inside the dark, terrifying cabin, Clara squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing openly as Lily buried her tiny face into her mother's chest, screaming in absolute, unadulterated terror. The heavy, bulletproof glass of their window was holding, but it was quickly spider-webbing into a million tiny, white cracks under the sustained, punishing assault. Dominic remained crouched fiercely over them, his dark eyes burning with a cold, murderous fury. Silas had moved incredibly fast, springing his deadly trap before Dominic could effectively purge his compromised reins. The traitorous underboss wanted to slaughter the king on the open road, leaving his body to freeze in the snow alongside the woman and child who had inadvertently exposed the massive, multi-million-dollar theft. The sound of heavy boots crunching rapidly across the snow signaled that the massive hit squad was violently closing the distance, completely surrounding the crippled, smoking vehicles. One of Dominic's loyal guards screamed out in sudden, agonizing pain as a heavy round found a fatal mark, the terrible sound cutting straight through Clara's terrified heart. The absolute, suffocating realization that they were entirely trapped on an isolated road with absolutely no reinforcements descending upon them froze the blood in her veins. The smell of burning rubber, leaking gasoline, and hot copper filled the freezing air, choking her as she clung desperately to her weeping daughter. Dominic pulled a heavy, loaded pistol from his tactical vest, his large hand gripping the weapon with a deadly, calm certainty. He looked down at Clara, his face inches from hers in the dark, chaotic floorboard. The profound, vulnerable man from the library was completely gone, instantly replaced by the terrifying, ruthless mafia boss preparing to absolutely butcher anyone who dared to touch what belonged to him. The glass of the passenger window finally gave way with a sickening, explosive crash, showering the interior with thousands of sharp, freezing fragments as the enemy closed in for the absolute, final kill. The thousands of shattered glass fragments rained down upon Dominic's broad back like freezing diamonds as the passenger window finally gave way completely. A masked shooter lunged forward through the smoking frame, his weapon raised for a point-blank execution, but Dominic was infinitely faster. The heavy pistol in his hand roared twice in rapid, deafening succession, sending the attacker violently backward into the slush. But the brief, explosive exchange of close-quarters fire exacted a terrible, devastating toll. A high-caliber round tore straight through the reinforced door panel and slammed directly into the side of Dominic's tactical vest, finding the vulnerable gap just beneath his ribs. The sheer kinetic force of the heavy bullet lifted his massive frame a fraction of an inch before he collapsed heavily against the torn leather seat. He let out a sharp, ragged gasp, his dark eyes widening in sudden, blinding agony as hot, dark blood immediately began to soak through his expensive layers. Clara screamed his name, a raw, terrified sound that was instantly swallowed by the relentless, deafening crossfire raging outside the crippled vehicle. "Run," Dominic choked out, his gravelly voice bubbling with absolute pain as he desperately tried to push himself back up. "Take Lily and run to the tree line." He shoved his heavy pistol blindly toward her trembling hands, fully prepared to stay behind and bleed out on the freezing floorboards to buy them exactly 30 seconds of precious time. Outside, Marco roared a furious command, emptying a high-capacity magazine into the advancing Russian line to create a momentary, desperate opening. Clara looked at the heavy weapon, then looked at the terrifying, absolute certainty in Dominic's fading eyes. He fully expected her to leave him. He fully expected to die alone in the cold, just as his family had died a decade ago. But a fierce, blinding fire suddenly ignited deep within Clara's chest, a primal, raw survival instinct forged in the absolute darkest, most desperate gutters of the city. She had spent her entire life running from monsters, but she absolutely refused to abandon the only man who had ever stood between her and the wolves. "I am not leaving you," she screamed back, completely ignoring the heavy pistol. She grabbed Lily by the collar of her oversized coat and violently kicked the remaining, compromised hinges of the opposite side door until it groaned completely open into the deep snow ditch. "Move," she commanded her weeping daughter, shoving the terrified 6-year-old into the freezing, waist-deep snow. Clara turned back and grabbed the lapels of Dominic's heavy, blood-soaked coat with both of her small, freezing hands. Adrenaline, pure and absolute, flooded her veins as she hauled the 200-pound, semi-conscious mafia king out of the shattered cabin. They tumbled together into the freezing ditch just as another volley of heavy gunfire absolutely shredded the empty back seat where they had been hiding seconds before. Dominic groaned in raw agony, his massive legs entirely useless, his left hand pressing desperately against the gaping, arterial wound in his side. "Get up," Clara pleaded fiercely, pulling his heavy, uninjured arm directly over her fragile shoulders. "You have to help me walk." Marco laid down a final, massive wall of suppressing fire, screaming for them to vanish into the dense, dark woods. Clara dragged Dominic forward, every single step a monumental, agonizing battle against the deep snow and his massive, dead weight. Lily clung desperately to her mother's coat, crying silently as they plunged deeper and deeper into the terrifying, freezing darkness of the skeletal trees. The chaotic sounds of the brutal firefight slowly faded into muffled, distant pops behind them, entirely replaced by the loud, ragged sound of their own frantic breathing and the sickening, wet squelch of Dominic's blood dripping onto the pristine white snow. They walked blindly for over 30 minutes through the treacherous, freezing wilderness, the absolute, biting cold, seeping deep into their bones. Dominic was failing rapidly, his heavy head rolling limply against Clara's shivering neck, his dark eyes fluttering dangerously shut. Just as her exhausted legs threatened to give out completely, the jagged, rusted silhouette of a massive abandoned industrial warehouse emerged from the swirling blizzard. Clara dragged him through a broken, rusted metal door, collapsing onto the frozen concrete floor in the pitch-black, cavernous interior. The wind howled violently through the broken skylights, but they were finally completely hidden from the murderous hunting party. Dominic lay flat on his back, his skin the color of dirty ash, his breathing incredibly shallow and dangerously fast. Clara fell to her knees beside him in the freezing dark, her hands completely slick with his warm blood. She did not hesitate or panic. The chaotic street survival that had kept her alive for 26 years took absolute control. She pulled a rusted, discarded iron pipe from the debris and violently ripped the long, thick scarf from around her own neck. She wrapped the heavy fabric tightly around his bleeding torso, positioning the thick knot directly over the massive exit wound, and used the iron pipe to twist the makeshift tourniquet with brutal, agonizing force. Dominic arched his back off the frozen concrete with a ragged, tortured scream, his large hands blindly grasping her wrists. "I know," Clara sobbed, twisting the iron pipe one final, brutal turn to completely staunch the massive arterial flow. "I am sorry. You have to stay awake. Look at me." She tied the pipe securely in place and immediately began to ruthlessly slap his pale cheeks, forcing his heavy, dark eyes to open. "Do not close your eyes," she ordered fiercely, her tears dropping onto his blood-stained face. Lily curled into a tiny, shivering ball against his uninjured side, pressing her small, freezing hands against his chest as if she could magically push the life back into his failing heart. Dominic stared up at Clara's wild, tear-streaked face in the freezing dark of the abandoned warehouse. He could feel the absolute, agonizing pain radiating from his shattered ribs, but he could also feel the incredibly fierce, desperate pressure of her hands holding him to the earth. For his entire life, men had fought fiercely for his money, killed brutally for his territory, and died horribly for the terrifying power of his bloody crown. He had built a massive, untouchable empire entirely out of fear and absolute greed. But looking at this exhausted, terrified single mother, a woman who had literally dragged his massive, bleeding body through half a mile of deep snow rather than walk away a free woman, a profound, world-shifting realization washed over his fading mind. She did not care about his massive wealth. She did not care about his absolute power. She was fighting like a cornered, savage animal simply because she wanted him to live. She was the very first person in 10 long, agonizing years who had genuinely fought for the man and not the crown. He reached up with a weak, trembling, blood-stained hand, his rough fingers gently grazing her cold, wet cheek. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice incredibly weak but filled with absolute, undeniable wonder. Clara grabbed his hand tightly, pressing it fiercely against her own beating heart, refusing to let him slip away into the dark. "I told you," she whispered back, her voice breaking completely in the freezing, echoing warehouse. "I am never leaving you." The freezing darkness of the abandoned warehouse was suddenly shattered by the blinding sweep of heavy tactical headlights slicing brutally through the broken, jagged skylights. Clara instinctively threw her exhausted, shivering body completely over Dominic and Lily, her freezing fingers curling desperately around the rusted iron pipe, fully prepared to die swinging blindly in the pitch-black dirt to protect the only family she had left. But the massive, terrifying figures kicking through the rusted metal doors did not wear the cheap dark coats of the Russian hit squad. They moved with absolute, silent precision, wearing the heavy tactical gear of the Chicago Syndicate, led by a bleeding but ferociously alive Marco. The Loyalist reinforcements had finally arrived, tearing through the violent blizzard with an army of heavily armed men to secure the compromised perimeter. The extraction was a chaotic, dizzying blur of shouted commands, blinding flashlights, and the sterile, sharp smell of emergency medical supplies completely overpowering the metallic stench of fresh blood. A trauma medic worked frantically on the cold concrete floor, plunging thick needles into Dominic's pale arm, pumping him full of synthetic clotting agents and massive doses of raw adrenaline, binding his torn side with thick, heavy gauze. Dominic did not slip into the peaceful, merciful oblivion of unconsciousness. Instead, as the potent drugs violently flooded his failing system, the incredibly vulnerable, dying man Clara had held tightly in the dark completely vanished, locked away behind a terrifying wall of ice. His dark eyes snapped open, burning with a cold, absolute, and murderous wrath that seemed to instantly drop the ambient temperature of the entire warehouse by another 20 degrees. He absolutely refused the waiting helicopter meant to transport him to a secure, underground surgical wing. Barely patched up, his expensive dark dress shirt soaked entirely in his own drying blood, Dominic Vidiello demanded a secure mobile communications terminal. For the next 12 agonizing hours, Clara sat rigidly in the reinforced back of a heavily armored mobile command center, holding a blissfully sleeping Lily against her chest, and witnessed the true, devastating scale of the monster she had just saved. Running on pure, unadulterated rage and raw chemical adrenaline, Dominic unleashed the absolute, terrifying might of his criminal empire upon the city of Chicago. He did not issue threats or warnings. He issued absolute extermination orders. Clara listened in suffocating, terrified silence as he methodically orchestrated a ruthless, systematic purge across the entire frozen city. Safe houses belonging to the Russian loan sharks were brutally raided and burned completely to the ground. Rival enforcers were hunted down like rabid dogs in the snowy streets and systematically eliminated without a single ounce of mercy. He was a terrifying conductor of absolute carnage, directing a massive symphony of blood and fire with quiet, gravelly commands spoken calmly into encrypted phones. But the absolute climax of his brutal, bloody retaliation was reserved entirely for the arrogant architect of the betrayal. By midnight, Marco's vast intelligence network had finally cornered Silas. The traitorous underboss was frantically attempting to board a sleek private charter jet at a small, isolated airstrip on the far outskirts of the city, desperate to escape into the winter night with the $4 million he had systematically stolen from the logistics ledgers. Dominic ordered the armored convoy to intercept immediately, absolutely refusing to let his loyal men handle the final execution. When the heavy, black vehicles violently breached the chain-link perimeter fencing of the frozen tarmac, Dominic pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the freezing, swirling snow. His broad posture was incredibly rigid despite the agonizing, fresh bullet wound actively tearing at his bandaged ribs. Clara watched through the thick, reinforced glass of the SUV, her breath fogging the cold window, completely paralyzed and unable to look away from the terrifying spectacle unfolding under the harsh runway lights. Silas was dragged kicking and screaming onto the icy tarmac by two massive syndicate enforcers, his expensive leather luggage spilling uselessly across the wet runway, raining stacks of stolen $100 bills into the dirty slush. The treacherous underboss fell violently to his knees, begging desperately for his miserable life, sobbing openly as he offered to return every single stolen penny, pleading frantically for a shred of the mercy that Dominic had never possessed. Dominic did not say a single word. He did not shout in anger, nor did he display a single ounce of recognizable human emotion. He simply drew his heavy, black pistol from his shoulder holster, walked calmly forward through the blinding snow with the pronounced, agonizing length, and placed the cold steel barrel directly against the forehead of the man who had cowardly ordered the brutal hit on Clara and her innocent daughter. The loud, deafening crack of the gunshot echoed violently across the empty airfield, silencing Silas's pathetic, sobbing begging in a single, permanent instant. The traitor's lifeless body collapsed heavily into the dirty slush, a stark, bloody testament to the absolute, terrifying cost of crossing the reigning king of Chicago. Dominic stood perfectly still over the bleeding corpse for a long, heavy moment, his broad shoulders rising and falling heavily, the smoking weapon dangling loosely from his large, scarred hand. He looked exactly like an apex predator perfectly at peace in a slaughterhouse, totally unbothered by the brutal taking of a human life. Clara watched the dark, crimson blood pooling rapidly around Silas's ruined head, her stomach twisting into a violent, sickening knot of pure, visceral horror. This was the terrifying, bloody reality of Dominic's true nature. He was not a misunderstood hero forced into a difficult life. He was an absolute monster to his enemies, a man fully capable of pulling a trigger and ending a life without a single flinch or an ounce of lingering regret. The very same large, scarred hands that had so gently taped her daughter's broken red crayon back together had just executed a man in cold blood. As Dominic slowly turned his terrifying, dark gaze back toward the idling armored vehicle, his eyes completely hollow and dead in the harsh runway lights, Clara felt a massive, suffocating weight crash down heavily upon her fragile chest. He had absolutely done this horrific violence to protect his crumbling empire and to exact unnecessary vengeance, but he had also done it to absolutely ensure that no one would ever dare to hunt her or her daughter ever again. She was deeply, irreversibly tethered to a ruthless man whose very existence required constant, brutal violence and absolute control. She pulled a sleeping Lily tighter against her trembling chest, burying her face in the child's soft hair, her exhausted mind forced to brutally confront the terrifying question echoing loudly in the silent, bloody aftermath of the purge. She had bravely saved the devil's life in the freezing woods, choosing him over her own safe escape, but she simply did not know if her fragile, exhausted soul could possibly stomach the endless, terrifying rivers of blood that inherently came with standing faithfully by his side. The violent storm that had swallowed Chicago for nearly a week finally broke on a quiet Thursday morning, leaving the sprawling stone compound bathed in a blinding, brilliant winter sun. The air was incredibly still, the heavy, suffocating tension of the bloody purge completely washed away by the fresh, glittering snow. Inside the massive oak doors of the private study, Dominic Vitiello sat behind his polished mahogany desk, his broad chest wrapped tightly in thick white bandages beneath a dark, tailored shirt. He looked incredibly pale and profoundly exhausted, the brutal toll of the gunshot wound and the ruthless execution of Silas weighing heavily upon his broad shoulders. He stared at a thick, unmarked manila envelope resting in the exact center of his immaculate desk, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped furiously in his cheek. The heavy wooden doors opened slowly, and Clara stepped into the quiet room. She wore a simple, soft gray sweater, her dark hair pulled back, her wide brown eyes entirely devoid of the frantic, hunted terror that had defined her existence just days ago. She moved with a quiet, grounded strength as she crossed the massive Persian rug, stopping right in front of the heavy desk. Dominic did not meet her gaze right away. He stared at the envelope for a long, heavy moment before finally sliding it slowly across the polished wood toward her. "The Russian accounts have been permanently closed," he stated quietly, his gravelly voice incredibly hollow and devoid of all emotion. "Your father's street debt of $450,000 has been completely erased. You owe absolutely nothing to the syndicate. You owe absolutely nothing to me." Clara looked down at the thick envelope, but did not reach for it. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Inside that envelope, Dominic continued, his dark eyes finally looking up to meet hers, carrying the devastating, agonizing weight of a man actively tearing out his own heart. "You will find clean, untraceable identification documents for you and Lily. There is also a secure offshore trust fund containing $5 million. It is more than enough to ensure that neither of you will ever have to scrub another floor or run from another monster for the rest of your natural lives. Marco has a discreet, armored car idling at the front gates. He will take you anywhere in the world you want to go, and absolutely no one from this city will ever look for you again." The heavy, suffocating silence stretched between them, thick with the agonizing memory of the bloody runway, the deafening gunshot, and the terrifying reality of the brutal empire he ruled. He was giving her the ultimate, perfect escape. He fully expected her to take it and run as far away from his blood-soaked hands as humanly possible. Clara stared at the manila envelope, the promise of absolute, unquestionable safety resting right at her fingertips. She closed her eyes for a brief second, the terrifying image of Silas collapsing onto the freezing tarmac flashing violently through her mind. She knew exactly what Dominic was. She knew that he commanded an army of killers and ruled an empire forged entirely in violence. But as she opened her eyes and looked deeply into Dominic's haunted, grieving face, she also remembered the towering man who had shielded her daughter in the snowy plaza without a second of hesitation. She remembered the desperately vulnerable survivor who had confessed his greatest tragedy in the warm light of the library fire. She remembered the bleeding, dying king in the freezing warehouse who had stared up at her with absolute, undeniable wonder simply because she had refused to let him die alone. Clara reached out slowly, her trembling fingers brushing against the thick manila envelope. She did not pick it up. Instead, She pushed it firmly back across the polished mahogany desk, the heavy paper sliding to a complete stop right in front of Dominic. He blinked, a flash of genuine, unadulterated shock breaking through his cold, terrifying armor. "I am not leaving," Clara said quietly, her voice ringing with a fierce, unbreakable resolve that echoed clearly in the quiet study. "You think I want to run away from the only person who has ever made me feel completely safe?" Dominic stood up slowly, completely ignoring the sharp, agonizing pain flaring in his heavily bandaged ribs, his dark eyes wide with disbelief. "Clara," he whispered hoarsely, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You saw exactly what I am. You saw what I do to people who cross me. I am a monster." Clara stepped around the massive desk, completely invading his personal space, her brown eyes blazing with absolute, undeniable certainty. "The world is entirely full of monsters," she replied fiercely, reaching out to gently rest her hands against his broad, solid chest, careful to avoid his fresh wound. "But you are my monster. You are our sanctuary. I spent my entire life running from the dark, but I am not running anymore. I choose this. I choose you." Dominic stared down at her, the thick, suffocating ice that had encased his bleeding heart for 10 agonizing years finally shattering completely. He let out a ragged, heavy breath, his large, scarred hands reaching out to pull her fragile body fiercely against his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, holding her with the desperate, overwhelming strength of a drowning man who had finally found dry land. It was not a polished or composed embrace. It was raw, desperate, and profoundly healing. The heavy oak doors of the study suddenly burst open, and Lily ran happily into the room, completely oblivious to the massive emotional shift, dragging a massive stuffed bear that Teresa had given her. She ran straight toward the desk, her bright laughter filling the dark corners of the room, and wrapped her tiny arms tightly around Dominic's solid leg. Dominic looked down at the bright, smiling child, then back up at the fierce, resilient woman holding his heart, and a genuine, incredibly rare smile finally broke across his scarred face. He was still the ruthless, terrifying head of the Chicago Syndicate, a man fully capable of absolute violence, but he was no longer ruling a cold, empty empire. He had a family again, a fiercely protected, unbreakable chosen family, and he would absolutely burn the entire world to the ground to keep them safe. That is where our story wraps up for now, my friends. I have to admit, sharing this intense, dramatic journey with you really touched something incredibly deep within my own heart. This story beautifully reminds us that true redemption does not always come wrapped in a perfect, innocent package. Sometimes, the greatest rescue is simply choosing to stay, choosing to look past the terrifying scars and the dark pasts to find the fiercely protective, loyal heart beating underneath. When we consciously choose to build a family out of the broken pieces of our lives, we do not just survive the violent storms, we actually become a living, breathing sanctuary for each other in the smallest, most steady ways. And that is exactly how we slowly begin to heal. I am incredibly curious, did Clara's brave, unwavering choice to stay with Dominic reach into your own heart, or perhaps bring up a memory of a time you had to choose loyalty over fear? Please let me know down in the comments, because I absolutely always love reading your beautiful stories and deep reflections. If this powerful mafia romance moved you today, I would be so incredibly grateful if you would like, share, and subscribe to Sunni Romance. It is absolutely the best way to keep these amazing stories going and help our wonderful little community grow even stronger. And if you are actively searching for more thrilling inspiration and intense love stories, you will find plenty more videos and curated playlists waiting right here on your screen. Thank you so much for spending this quiet, emotional moment with me. I am wishing you incredible warmth, unwavering courage, and the absolute comfort of steady, loyal company. I promise I will be back with another breathtaking story very soon. Take good care, my friend.